The storm came in from the south like something that had been building its anger for 1,000 miles. Colt Maddox sat alone at the far end of the bar in a place called Decker's in Pueblo, Colorado, and he watched the weather change through the single window that faced the street. The sky had gone the color of an old bruised purple
He's
and
strong. He'll
yellow
be
and
all right.
wrong, and the few
So
people still
scared.
out on the
We're together
boardwalk were
now.
moving
Rest.
fast, heads down, pulling collars up against a wind that had teeth in it. He had been sitting there for 2 hours, maybe 3. The whiskey in front of him had gone warm, and he had not touched it in a long time. The bartender was an old man with hands that had seen hard work and a face that had learned not to ask questions he did not want answered. He had refilled Colt's glass once without being asked and then left him alone, which was the only thing Colt wanted from another human being on that particular evening in November of 1887. Outside, a woman grabbed her hat against the wind and hurried into the dry goods store. A dog crossed the street at a run tail tucked heading for somewhere better. The first snow came sideways, just a few flake scouts sent ahead to report on what was waiting. Colt looked at his hands on the bar. They were big hands, the kind that came from years of real work, and they carried the record of everything he had done with them. There was a scar across the right, long and pale from a fence wire that had snapped back when he was 26 years old on a ranch in Texas that he had spent 14 years building from scrubland and stubbornness into something a man could be proud of. There were calluses in the specific places that came from rope work and hammer work and the daily language of frontier life. His knuckles were large and a little off-center from breaks that had healed the way breaks healed when a man did not stop working long enough to let them set properly. He was 38 years old and he felt much older than that. 8 years, he thought. 8 years of moving north and then west and then north again. Never staying long enough to leave a mark on any place, never finding a reason to stop. Fort Worth to Abilene to Dodge City to Denver, then smaller towns, then smaller still, then places that barely had names. Always the same calculation when the weather warmed up or when the work dried up or when the particular silence of a Sunday morning in a strange town became too heavy to carry, time to move on. The old bartender set a fresh glass of water beside the whiskey without saying anything. Colt looked up. The old man met his eyes for just a moment, then looked away, the way people look away from things that are too familiar and too sad to examine directly. "You running from something?" the bartender asked, his voice low, not quite making it a question. "Could be," Colt said. "Running long, in 8 years." The old man absorbed this the way old men absorb difficult information slowly without visible reaction, filing it somewhere deep where it would be considered later or not at all. "Thing chasing you," he said. "It got legs." "No," Colt said. "That's the problem. Can't outrun what lives in your own head." The bartender nodded once, the nod of a man who has arrived at that particular understanding himself at some point in his own life through his own specific variety of loss. He did not say anything else. He moved to the other end of the bar and left Colt alone with the untouched whiskey and the darkening window and the sound of the storm beginning its serious work outside. Colt thought about Emily. He did not do this on purpose. He had spent 8 years constructing careful systems to prevent it filling his days with the physical exhaustion of hard labor, filling his nights with the particular blankness that came from being too tired to dream. But in quiet moments in bars like this one, when the whiskey had gone warm and the weather was turning bad, she came back to him with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Her laugh, the way she pushed her hair back when she was thinking hard about something, the small wooden cross she wore that he had found in the pocket of her winter coat when he was sorting through her things because someone had to sort through her things and he was the only one left. His son had not lived long enough to need things sorted. He had not lived long enough to need much of anything. 7 days. The fever had taken Emily in 4 and the baby in 7, and Colt had stood in the frozen ground behind the small church in Hatcher, Texas on a morning so cold the preacher's breath made clouds between his words, and he had said goodbye to everyone he had built his life around. He had sold the ranch 3 weeks later, did not negotiate, did not wait for a better offer, just signed the papers and handed over the keys to the gate and rode north and never looked back, which was the only decision he had made in those weeks that he fully understood even now. The money from the sale was still mostly intact, folded into a leather pouch inside his saddlebag. He had not known what to do with it. It felt wrong to spend it on himself, and wrong to give it away, and wrong to keep it, So he had simply carried it with him, one more weight among the many, waiting for a reason to exist. He left Decker's just before dark and paid his bill and walked out into the beginning of the worst storm he had seen in years. Ranger stood tied at the post outside, patient, as he always was, his dark coat already starting to catch the first serious snow. The horse was 12 years old and had been with Colt for all of it, the building years and the lost years and the wandering years, and there was a communication between them that did not require words. Colt put his hand on the horse's neck and felt the animal lean into it just slightly. "One more night," Colt told him, "then we'll find somewhere to wait this out." He had no specific direction in mind. He never did anymore. He simply pointed Ranger north because north was the direction he had been going for a while now, and he rode into the storm. The wind picked up within the first mile. Within 5 miles, it was serious. Within 10 miles, visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and Colt knew that he had made a mistake by riding out into this instead of staying in Pueblo and waiting for it to pass. But he had been in Pueblo for 3 days, and 3 days was already longer than he usually stayed anywhere, and the particular weight of that Sunday morning quiet had been pressing down on him all day, and he had needed to move. Movement was the only medicine he had found that worked, for a little while anyway. Ranger began to labor around the 12th mile, not dramatically, not a sudden collapse, but the small increasing resistance of a good animal working harder than was good for him, the rhythm changing in a way that Colt felt through the saddle before he heard it in the horse's breathing. He slowed to a walk and tried to find anything in the white dark around him that looked like shelter. There was nothing. Wind, snow, the suggestion of a tree line somewhere to the east too far to matter. Then a light, faint, yellow, barely there through the curtain of snow, but real. Colt changed direction toward it without deciding, to the way a man moves toward warmth when cold has become serious. He did not think about who might be at the end of that light or what they might think of a stranger riding up in a blizzard at 10 o'clock at night. He thought about Ranger, whose breathing had developed a new sound to catch at the end of each exhale that Colt did not like. "Almost there," he told the horse. "Just a little further." The light resolved itself slowly into a window, and the window into a cabin, and the cabin into a modest homestead sitting alone in the white nowhere of eastern Colorado, with a wood pile to one side and what appeared to be a barn, or at least a substantial outbuilding, to the other. There was a fence line barely visible through the snow, recent damage to one section where a post had gone over, and a porch that ran the width of the front of the structure. Colt dismounted carefully, his legs stiff from the cold and the riding, and led Ranger the last 30 yards on foot. He tied the horse to the porch rail, which was not where a horse belonged in this weather, and climbed the steps. He knocked 3 times. Not loud, not soft. The knock of a man who understood that he was asking for something and was trying to ask in a way that did not sound like demanding. Silence from inside. Then a voice. "Who's there?" Colt registered several things about that voice in the single second it took to hear it. It was a woman's voice, which he had half expected given the homestead's condition and the absence of any man-sized equipment visible from the porch. It was younger than the situation around it, and it did not shake. That last thing mattered more than the others. He had ridden up in the dark in a blizzard and knocked on a stranger's door, and the woman inside had not screamed and had not gone silent and had not simply not answered. She had asked the question that needed asking in a voice that suggested she was prepared to deal with whatever answer she received. "Name's Colt Maddox," he said, directing his voice at the door. "Not looking for trouble, ma'am. My horse needs shelter. I've got money." A pause. Not a frightened pause, more like a considering one. "There's a town 5 miles east," the voice said. 5 miles might as well be 50 in this weather. "My horse is about done." Another pause. "I'm armed," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," Colt said. "Step back from the door if you need to. I'm not moving until you're comfortable." He heard the faint sound of movement inside, then the distinct sound of a latch being worked, and the door opened. The cold hit her, first the wall of frozen air pushing through the new gap, and he saw her flinch against it even as she held her ground. She was small, which surprised him somehow, though it should not have. The voice had suggested someone larger. She was maybe 5'3", slim, the way people get slim when they are working too hard and eating too little, and she was holding a rifle that was genuinely too big for her, holding it correctly, though, the way a person holds a firearm when they know what it does. She was, he estimated, somewhere around 24 years old. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of weeks of poor sleep and months of carrying something heavy, and her hair was coming loose from whatever it had been pinned into, and her dress was practical and mended and not quite warm enough for the temperature the open door was now creating. But her eyes were steady. Gray-green, he thought, or maybe just gray in this light. Either way, they were looking at him with the careful assessment of someone who had learned that first impressions were information to be gathered and analyzed, not feelings to be surrendered to. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. It came out before he thought about it. "The way you were talking, I thought you might be 6 feet tall." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. A recognition of the absurdity of the situation, maybe. A flicker of something human in the middle of all the practical difficulty. "I'm tall enough to work this trigger," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I don't doubt it." He held his hands out to the sides, showing her they were empty. Then he tilted his head back toward Ranger, standing in the snow with his head down and his sides heaving. "My horse," Colt said simply. She looked past him at the animal. He watched her take in the condition of the horse, the labored stance, the frosted coat, the way Ranger's near foreleg was carrying less weight than it should have been. He watched her face do something complicated. A woman who knew livestock, he thought. She knows exactly what she is looking at. "The barn's around back," she said. Her voice had changed, not softer exactly, but different, more certain. "There's hay in the loft. I'll need to trust you not to be a fool about this." "You'll have my word that the horse is the only reason I knocked on your door," he said. "I can sleep in the barn if that's what you need. I won't set foot near your house without being asked." She studied him for another moment. Whatever she found in that study, it was apparently enough. "What did you say your name was?" "Colt Maddox." "Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "Eleanor Whitfield." Then, as if correcting herself, "Ellie." She said the shorter version, like she was deciding in that moment which version of herself was going to deal with whatever this night turned into. Colt led Ranger around to the barn. He worked by lamplight for 2 hours doing what needed doing for the horse before anything else. Unsaddled him and got the wet saddle blanket off and rubbed him down with the dry burlap he found hanging on a nail by the door. Checked the near foreleg carefully, working his hands down from the knee, feeling for heat or swelling. Found some swelling around the fetlock, not serious but enough to explain the way the horse had been moving in the last few miles. Cold compress first, then rest. He found a horse blanket folded over the stall rail and got it across Ranger's back. Found a water that had not quite frozen over in the trough and let the horse drink what he wanted. Then hay. Then checking his own hands where the cold had cracked the skin across his knuckles. He worked quietly, methodically, the way he had always worked, without wasted motion and without hurry, because hurry usually created more problems than it solved. The barn was in reasonable condition, better than the house looked from outside, and there were 2 other animals in it, a milk cow and what appeared to be a laying hen operation in the back corner that was more organized than he would have expected from a single woman managing a failing homestead. He talked to Ranger quietly while he worked. Not words exactly. A low, continuous sound, the voice you used with horses and with people in pain, the tone that said, "I am here, and I am paying attention, and nothing is going to get worse right now." It was a habit he had developed working cattle in Texas, the discovery that animals responded to the quality of a voice more than to its content, and over the years it had become as natural as breathing. He did not know that there was a window in the barn that faced the back of the cabin, or that the lamp in that window had gone dark sometime around midnight, or that someone had been standing in that darkness looking out. He suspected, but he did not know. He bedded down in the loft with his saddle blanket and his coat, in the particular combination of exhaustion and cold that in his experience was more effective than whiskey for producing sleep. The storm worked at the barn walls all night, finding every gap and probing at every loose board, and the animals shifted in their stalls below him, and Colt Maddox slept more soundly than he had slept in months. He did not know why. He was up before the sun because that was also a habit that had outlasted everything else, and he had Ranger's leg checked and rewrapped, and had fed all the animals and started a small fire in the stove he found in the corner of the barn before the light outside had fully committed to being morning. The storm had passed in the night. The world it had left behind was white and still and savagely cold, the kind of cold that had a sound to it, a faint, crystalline ringing at the edge of hearing that came from moisture, freezing in the air itself. The snow lay in drifts that in places reached the lower rail of the fence and the path between the barn and the house was buried under a good 2 feet. He saw her coming when she was about halfway. She was moving with purpose, which he respected, but she was moving in boots that were not equal to what she was asking them to do. And she was navigating by memory rather than by sight, because the drifts had changed everything since she had last made this trip. He was watching from just inside the barn door when he saw her foot catch on something invisible below the snow surface. The fence rail, he thought, the one that had come down. She went down hard. Colt was already moving. He covered the distance in a fraction of the time it would have taken her to get back up, even if her body had been willing to cooperate. And when he reached her, she was lying face down in the snow, with one hand pressed against the ground in an effort to push herself upright that was not going well. "Don't," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder. Not gripping, not forcing, just indicating. "Don't fight it yet. Tell me where you're hurt." "I'm not hurt," she said into the snow. "I just need a moment." "You've been in this snow for about 30 seconds and the temperature is below zero," he said, keeping his voice the same way he kept his voice with frightened livestock, even and unhurried. "Your coat is not warm enough for this. Take a breath. I need to check the animals." "The animals are checked. They're fed and watered and the cow's been let out of her stall. I did it an hour ago." A pause, then slowly she turned her head so one eye was visible above the snow line, looking up at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "You fed my animals. They were hungry. You went into my barn." "Ranger was already in your barn," he said reasonably. It seemed like the logical place to be. Another pause. He could see something happening in that visible eye, some internal conversation running its course. "My knee," she said finally. "I landed on my knee." He helped her up, carefully supporting the effort without taking it over, which was a distinction he had always thought was important and which most people never bothered to make. She got her feet under her and stood, and he watched her put weight on the right knee and watched her face when she did it. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Can you walk without making that face?" She looked at him. The expression was not quite indignation and not quite amusement. It occupied some territory between the two that he found unexpectedly interesting. "I can walk," she said. "Then let's get you inside before the not hurt knee also becomes a problem." He walked beside her back to the barn rather than back to the cabin because the barn was closer and already warm, and she did not argue with this decision, which told him something about the state of the knee that her words had not. He settled her on a bale of hay near the stove and brought her a cup of hot water with dried herbs he had found in her kitchen when he had gone in looking for coffee because the door had not been locked, and the herbs were the kind that were good for cold and shock and the kind of tired that lived in muscles rather than in eyes. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at him over the rim. "You went into my kitchen," she said, "looking for coffee. I apologize, I should have asked." "You should have," she agreed. "Then there isn't any coffee. I ran out 3 weeks ago." He nodded and said nothing, but he made a mental note. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for the animals, and for this." "You would have gotten up on your own," he said, eventually. "I know." They looked at each other across the middle distance of the barn, and in that look was the beginning of a kind of understanding that did not yet have words for itself. He was a stranger, and she was alone, and the situation was as complicated as any situation between a strange man and a woman on her own was ever going to be, and both of them understood that perfectly, and both of them were still sitting here in this barn, in the cold on either side of a small stove. Ranger shifted in his stall and blew out a slow breath. "Your horse," she said. "Will he be all right?" "Given a few days, yes. The leg isn't serious. He needs rest, and he needs to stay warm." She nodded slowly, looking at the horse with an attention that was evaluating rather than simply observing. "He's been with you a long time." 12 years. That's a long time to know anything." "Yes," Colt said. "It is." She looked back at him and said the thing he had been waiting for someone to ask, the question that was underneath every conversation he had with anyone who looked at him long enough to see that something was carrying him. "What are you running from, Mr. Maddox?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not know the answer, because the answer was the kind of thing that required deciding how much of it to give a stranger, and the woman sitting across from him had a quality of direct attention that made a partial answer feel worse than no answer at all. The same thing most people end up running from when they wind up in places like this, he said. A life that stopped fitting. What made it stop? He looked at his hands, the scarred right one, the left one that still sometimes felt the absence of the ring he had worn for 3 years beside Emily. Lost my wife, he said. Her name was Emily, and my son, 8 years ago. Fever took them both inside a week. My boy was 7 days old, he paused. After that, staying anywhere felt like standing in a house that had burned down. All the walls were still there, but nothing was real anymore. So I sold everything and left, and I've been moving since. She was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of someone who understood what he had just described well enough not to insult it with the wrong words. My parents died when I was 16, she said finally. Cholera, 2 days apart. I didn't have time to grieve properly because I needed to find somewhere to sleep and something to eat. Sometimes I think I'm still grieving and just doing it in between everything else. He looked at her. I know that feeling, he said. I know you do, she said. He told her about the roof then, because he had been looking at it from the barn and thinking about it, and because it was easier to talk about something practical than to sit in the difficult space they had just created between them. The north corner of your roof, he said. 3 of the supporting boards have gone to rot. The shingles over them are sitting on nothing. One more storm like last night, and you'll have a hole you can see the sky through. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who already knew and had been managing the knowledge. I'm aware, she said. I can fix it. She looked at him. I told you I can't pay. I'm not asking for pay. He thought about how to say the next part without making it sound like charity, because charity was not what he was offering. Ranger needs at least a week of rest before he's himself again. I don't sit still well. Your roof needs fixing. That's the whole of the equation. She studied him with those gray-green eyes that had a quality of patience in them, as if she was comfortable waiting for the full picture before she decided what to think. What do you get out of it? She asked. Something to do with my hands, he said. And then because she deserved honesty, he added, and maybe a reason not to get back on that horse and start moving again before I'm ready. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind moved over the new snow with a sound like breathing. The spare room is small, she said finally. Barely more than a closet with a window. Barn's fine if you'd rather. The spare room is warmer, she said with the precision of someone who made practical decisions and was not ashamed of it. You'll work on the roof, you'll take your meals at the table. You'll not go through my kitchen without asking first. Fair enough. And you'll tell me if that leg of Ranger's isn't getting better. I mean it. Don't be a man about it. Colt looked at the horse, looked back at her. I've been being a man about things for 38 years, he said. It's a hard habit to break. Try, she said, and there was something in that single word in the way it sat between request and instruction that felt less like a condition of the arrangement and more like an invitation to something larger. He was not sure she knew she had said it that way. He was not sure she would have taken it back if she did. He nodded once. Colt, he said, not Mr. Maddox, if I'm going to be eating at your table. She considered this. Ellie, she said, though I noticed you were already using it, I apologize. You don't mean it. No, he admitted, but it seemed polite to say. She almost smiled, not quite but almost, and in the cold winter light of the barn, with the storm just gone, and the morning starting up, outside Colt Maddox experienced the specific sensation of watching someone choose, against their better judgment, to find something funny. It lasted only a moment, but he noticed it the way he noticed things that mattered quietly and completely, and he stored it away. He went back to work on Ranger's leg. She went back to the house, carefully testing the knee on each step, with the dignity of someone who had refused help 3 times and was now paying the price, quietly and alone. He watched her go without appearing to watch. The morning opened up around the homestead white and absolute, and Colt found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He was thinking about tomorrow. Not in the way he usually thought about it as a continuation of the motion that kept the past from catching up, but as a specific day with specific things in it. The roof, the materials he would need, whether the post on the fallen fence section could be reset or would need replacing entirely. The coffee situation which he intended to address on whatever trip into Silver Ridge became necessary. He was planning. For a place that was not his. For a woman he had met 12 hours ago. In a life that he had spent 8 years making sure had no plans in it. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the house where a lamp had come on in the kitchen window, and he thought about the voice that had answered him through a closed door in the middle of a blizzard, the voice that had not shaken. He thought about what it had cost her not to let it shake. He thought about the mended dress and the not quite warm enough coat, and the way she had said, "I know that feeling," with the certainty of someone speaking from experience rather than sympathy. He thought about what she had said about grieving in the spaces between everything else. 5 miles from Silver Ridge, a man who had been moving for 8 years stood in a barn doorway and discovered that he did not want to get back on his horse. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. He did not examine this too closely because examining it too closely would require him to acknowledge things he was not quite ready to acknowledge. But he let it sit there, this unfamiliar stillness in the place where restlessness usually lived, and he breathed the cold morning air, and he went back inside to check on Ranger one more time before he went to find out what a roof that needed fixing actually needed. He did not know yet about Gerald Whitfield. He did not know about the notice in the kitchen drawer, the one with the red stamp and the 60-day deadline, and the sum of money that was a small fortune to a woman who had $47.23 to her name. He did not know about the coal under the eastern field, or the reason a man like Gerald would bother with a debt this size when the debt itself was not the point. He did not know about Deputy Frank Holt, or the particular quality of the look Holt had given Ellie the last time he had come out this way, the look that had made her move to the other side of the room and keep the table between them. He did not know any of it yet, but the storm that had brought him here had passed, and the world outside was quiet and white and waiting, and somewhere in the cabin the lamp in the kitchen window made a small yellow square of light against all that cold, and Colt Maddox for the first time in 8 years had somewhere to be in the morning. The morning after they arrived at their arrangement, Colt was up before the sun as always, and he stood on the porch in the dark with his coffee substitute and looked at the roof. He had already made his assessment from the barn the previous day, but assessment from a distance and assessment from the structure itself were different things, and he had learned over 20 years of fixing things that the difference usually cost you an extra 2 days of work if you skip the second step. He climbed up before Ellie had stirred inside, moving carefully across the frozen shingles, working his way to the north corner where the damage was. It was as bad as he had thought. 3 main support boards rotted through 2 more going soft, and the shingles above them, held in place by nothing but habit and the mercy of a winter that had not yet thrown everything at them. He spent an hour up there in the gray pre-dawn cold getting the full picture before he came down. She was at the kitchen window when he descended, her hands around a cup, watching him with the careful attention she gave to most things. "How bad?" she called from the door when he reached the porch. "Bad enough," he said, "but not as bad as it could have been. I'll need materials from Silver Ridge. 2 days, maybe 3, once I have what I need." "Make a list," she said. "I'll tell you what else is needed while you're going." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It already had coffee written at the top. She looked at the paper, then at him. "You wrote that before I asked," she said. "Yesterday when you mentioned you'd run out." She was quiet for a moment. "You pay attention," she said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite an observation. It was something more like recognition. "It's useful," he said. She gave him the rest of the list. He read it back to confirm each item which she had not asked him to do and which appeared to surprise her. And then he saddled Ranger's stallmate, a solid gray mare that Ellie said could be borrowed for the errand, and rode the 5 miles into Silver Ridge in the cold morning light. Silver Ridge was a frontier town in the particular stage of its development where it had decided it intended to stay, but had not yet fully convinced itself this was true. The church was solid, the bank was solid, the hotel had a real second floor, but the edges of the town were still provisional buildings that looked like they were waiting to see how things turned out before committing to permanence. Colt bought the roofing materials and the coffee and the items on Ellie's list and loaded everything onto the pack frame with the efficiency of a man who had done this kind of errand many times and saw no reason to make it take longer than necessary. He was almost done when the man in the expensive coat stopped beside him on the boardwalk. Colt had noticed him 20 minutes earlier, coming out of the land office, which he had filed away without deciding why. "New to the area?" the man asked. His voice had the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced making questions sound like conversation. Passing through, Colt said. He did not stop loading. Whereabouts are you staying? Around. He secured the last strap. You are? The man smiled. Gerald Whitfield. My family has had interests in this county for many years. Colt looked at him directly for the first time. 50-something, good coat. The hands of someone who had not done physical work in a long time but wanted you to think he still could. Eyes that were doing considerably more calculation than the pleasant expression above them suggested. Colt Maddox, he said. He did not extend a hand. Gerald's smile stayed exactly where it was, which was itself a kind of information. Well, Mr. Maddox, if you find yourself looking for work in the area, there are opportunities for a capable man. Come find me. I'll keep that in mind, Colt said, and turned the mare back toward the homestead. He did not tell Ellie about the conversation that evening, not because he was keeping it from her, but because he was still turning it over, fitting it against things he did not yet fully know. Gerald Whitfield, family interests in the county, the land office. He kept these pieces separate and let them find their own arrangement, the way he let difficult problems work themselves toward clarity if he gave them enough quiet. He started on the roof the next morning and worked through 2 full days with the concentration he brought to anything that had a right way and a wrong way. Ellie brought food out at midday each time without being asked to, and the first day she simply left it on the porch and went back inside. And the second day she sat on the porch steps while he came down and ate, and they talked about the work in the way that people talk when the conversation is really about something else, but neither party is ready to name it. On the 4th day of his staying there, she handed him a folded paper across the kitchen table without explanation. He read it. Notice of debt collection. Red stamp. Gerald Whitfield's name. $2,400. 32 days remaining from a 60-day deadline served 4 weeks ago. He read it again. How long have you had this? He asked. Since the day before you knocked on my door, she said. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, which he understood was not indifference, but the position of someone delivering difficult information and giving the other person space to receive it. And you didn't mention it. You were fixing my roof. He set the paper down. Ellie. She turned around. Her expression was the one he was beginning to recognize, the one that held more than it showed, that managed more than it let on. I'm telling you now, she said, because Gerald will be back, and when he comes back, it will be better if you know. What does he want? He says he wants the debt paid, but yesterday he mentioned mineral rights to the eastern field as a possible alternative. She held his gaze. He has never shown interest in this property before. Harold owed him money for years, and Gerhard never pressed. Then Harold died, and within 3 weeks the notice appeared. Colt looked at the eastern field through the kitchen window. I need to walk that field, he said. I'll come with you, she said. It's my field. They went out into the cold afternoon, and Colt walked the eastern quarter of the homestead with the attention he gave to things that mattered. He had spent 20 years reading land in Texas, learning the language of soil and stone, and the way certain formations indicated what lay beneath them. It was not a science exactly, more like a conversation between a man and the ground he was standing on, and it required patience and the willingness to get down on one knee in cold mud without worrying about the state of your trousers afterward. He got down on one knee several times. When he came back to where Ellie was waiting at the fence line, he was carrying a handful of soil that he held out to her. She looked at it without touching it. Coal, he said. Not a major deposit, but enough. Enough to matter to someone with the right connections and the right equipment and 20 years to work it. He let the soil fall through his fingers. Gerald knows. He knew before Harold died, I'd guess. That's why he wants the mineral rights instead of the money. The money is a lever to get them, not the point. Ellie stood very still. He watched her wash through it, the specific quality of her stillness when she was thinking fast. He manufactured the crisis, she said. He let it develop, which is worse. It requires patience. He looked at the field. He's been waiting for you to be desperate enough to take whatever he offers. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something more like the face of a person who had suspected something ugly and was now confirmed in that suspicion and was deciding what to do with the confirmation. I need a lawyer, she said. There's one in Denver. May Cooper mentioned him when she came by while you were in town 2 days ago. She looked at him. May came by. She wanted to know who was on the roof. I answered her questions. She answered some of mine. What did she tell you? That you've been alone here since August, that Harold borrowed money from Gerald informally with no written agreement, that Holt has been out here 3 times since Harold died, and that you've handled it. He paused. She worries about the handling. Ellie looked away toward the line of mountains that was just visible in the west. I've managed. I know you have, he said. That's not the question. She turned back. What is the question? He held her gaze. The question is whether you want to keep managing it alone or whether you're open to someone standing next to you while you manage it. The wind moved across the field between them. I don't know you well enough to answer that, she said. That's fair, he said. I'm not going anywhere. You've got time to decide. Gerald came 5 days later on a morning when the sky was clear and hard, and the cold had the quality of something that had settled in to stay. He arrived in his black lacquered wagon with Deputy Frank Holt riding behind him, and he descended onto the frozen ground with the careful management of his good boots that Colt, watching from the barn roof, where he was completing the final section of shingles, noted as the behavior of a man who was very conscious of appearances. Holt he had seen at a distance in Silver Ridge. Up close, the deputy had the posture of someone performing authority he was not entirely confident in, which in Colt's experience made such people more unpredictable rather than less. Colt watched Gerald approach the front door and knock, and Ellie appear into the frame. He watched the body language of what followed from above, the way Gerald moved forward slightly as he talked, the way Ellie held her position in the doorway without yielding an inch of it. Then he set down his hammer, came to the edge of the roof, gauged the drop to the porch, and stepped off. He landed in a crouch that absorbed the impact cleanly and straightened into standing without any theater of effort. Gerald took a step back. Holt's hand moved toward his holster and stopped. Colt walked to the yard and stood at a distance that was not aggressive and was not yielding, and looked at Gerald with the steady, unhurried look of a man who had already formed his assessment and was simply waiting for events to confirm it. Colt Maddox, he said. Gerald recovered himself with the skill of long practice. We've met, he said pleasantly. We have, Colt agreed. Gerald turned his attention back to Ellie and said the things he had come to say. The deadline unchanged. The mineral rights offer presented this time as generosity, rather than maneuver a chance for her to walk away from a difficult situation with her dignity intact. The implicit suggestion that a woman alone in this county would be better served by cooperation than by resistance. Ellie listened to all of it. She did not look at Colt once during the recitation. When Gerald finished, she said, I'll consider it. 25 days, Eleanor, Gerald said. I heard you the first time, she said. After Gerald's wagon had disappeared down the road and the sound of Holt's horse had faded, Ellie stood in the yard looking at the eastern field. Colt stood beside her. He was at the land office, Colt said. The morning I went into Silver Ridge for materials. I saw him coming out. She looked at him. You didn't tell me. I didn't know what I was seeing yet. I do now. He was quiet for a moment. There's no version of this where he accepts cash payment even if you had it. He needs the land itself, or at least what's under it. Then the debt is a fiction. The debt may or may not be real. The documentation of it almost certainly isn't. May said it was an informal arrangement. No written agreement. He looked at her. A lawyer in Denver can make something out of that. She turned to face him fully. You've been thinking about this. Since Silver Ridge, he said. Since I saw him coming out of the land office and didn't know yet why it mattered. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her hair across her face and she pushed it back, a quick, practical gesture that he had seen 3 or 4 times now, and that he found himself waiting to see again, not for any reason he could have articulated. I can't afford the train to Denver and a lawyer both, she said. The train is manageable, he said. May says Whitaker doesn't take money until the case is settled. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone calculating odds. All right, she said. Denver, but I want to go over Harold's papers first. Every piece of paper in that house. If Gerald has something he hasn't shown yet, I want to know what it says before it appears in front of a judge. Tonight, he said, after supper. She nodded once and went back inside. That night, they sat on either side of the kitchen table and went through Harold's wooden box of papers with the systematic patience of 2 people who understood that the answer they were looking for might be in the last document they opened. Colt read each one and set it in one of 3 piles, relevant, irrelevant, uncertain, and Ellie worked through her own stack with a speed that told him she read well and retained what she read. The stove made its small sounds in the corner. Outside, the night was still. They found no written loan agreement, no promissory note, no letter using the word loan. What they found in a bundle near the bottom of the box was a letter from Gerald dated 4 years earlier that referred to the arrangement we discussed, which was the language of a man who had been deliberate about what he committed to paper. He knew even then, Ellie said. She was holding the letter without looking at it, looking instead at some point above Colt's shoulder. He structured it without documentation on purpose, which makes it a deliberate scheme, not just a bad deal. Colt set the letter in the relevant pile. This is what Whitaker needs. She lowered her gaze to the letter in her hands. I married Harold because he was honest, she said. He told me exactly what he was offering and exactly what he expected. No pretenses. I respected that. She set the letter down. It never occurred to me that the land he was offering me was already compromised. Colt said nothing. He waited. I came out here on a train from Boston with a trunk and $30 and the understanding that I was entering a transaction that benefited both parties fairly. Yeah, she said. I kept my end of it. 3 years of keeping this house and these animals and his accounts and his meals and his laundry, 3 years of being useful and invisible in equal measure. She looked up. And now I'm sitting here with 25 days to keep from losing the only thing I've ever called mine. He looked at her across the lamp and the papers and the accumulated evidence of Harold's modest and complicated life. You're not going to lose it, he said. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know what Whitaker has to work with, and I know what Gerald is working without, and I know that the difference between those two things is substantial. He paused. And I know that you haven't run from a single hard thing since I've been here. She looked at him for a long moment. You've only been here 8 days, she said. Long enough, he said. A small silence. Then she began organizing the relevant pile into chronological order, her hands moving with the efficiency she brought to everything. And Colt watched her work and thought about the man in Decker's bar who had not touched his whiskey and had not known what he was moving toward when he stepped out into the storm. The second storm came 9 days after Colt's arrival, smaller and faster than the first, arriving around supper time and settling in for the night. There was nothing to do outside and nowhere to go, and after supper they sat by the stove in the main room. Ellie with the mending, she always seemed to have an infinite supply of Colt, with a piece of pine he had found in the barn, a knot-free length about 6 inches long that his hands had apparently decided was worth something. She watched him work with the small knife he produced from his coat pocket. Your father, she said after a while. You mentioned he was a woodworker. He looked up. Pennsylvania, he made furniture. Good furniture, the kind that lasted. Worked for a company that sold to wealthy families in Philadelphia. He died when I was 14. Mill accident. And you taught yourself from there. What he'd had time to show me and the rest by trial and error. I'm nowhere near what he was, but it keeps the hands busy on nights like this. She set down her mending. My father kept an accounting ledger, she said. Out for work, for the household. Every penny in and every penny out in the most precise handwriting I have ever seen. He said it was important to know exactly where you stood because reality, however difficult, was always preferable to uncertainty. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. She looked at the stove. I keep a ledger the same way. Harold thought it was unnecessary. He thought things would work themselves out. Did they? She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. They worked themselves into a notice with a red stamp. He set down the carving and looked at her directly. Ellie, I want to say something that I've been not saying for several days. She met his gaze. I have money, he said, from the sale of the ranch in Texas, enough to cover the debt and then some. I want to offer it, and I know you're going to refuse, and I'm asking you to at least hear my reasoning before you do. She was quiet, which he took as permission to continue. I've been carrying that money for 8 years without knowing what to do with it. It's the money from selling a place I built with Emily for a life that ended. Spending it on myself has always felt wrong. But using it to protect something real, something a person has earned and deserves to keep, that feels like the first reason I've found for it. She was quiet for a long time. No, she said finally. Her voice was even. I understand what you're offering and why, and I appreciate both. But that money is from your ranch, from Emily, from your son, from the life you built. I won't take it. She held his gaze. What I will take is your help finding another way. He looked at her. She had just refused what most people would have taken without hesitating, and she had done it without drama and without apology, and she had offered instead a collaboration rather than a charity, and he thought that this was possibly the most clear-eyed thing anyone had said to him in 8 years. Then we find another way, he said. She picked up the mending again. He picked up the knife. The stove made its small sounds. After a while, he set the finished carving on the table between them. A horse, small and precise, the legs somehow delicate. Despite the scale, the head turned slightly, as if the animal had just caught something on the wind. For you, he said, because this house needs something in it that someone made with care. She reached out and picked it up, turned it in her hands, feeling the smoothness of the finish, the clean lines. Thank you, she said softly. She placed it on the shelf above the kitchen window when she went to bed, and Colt, watching from across the room, thought that this was a thing a person did with something they intended to keep. May Cooper came the next morning with a pie and information in the order May always delivered things: comfort first and difficulty after. She sat across from Ellie with her coat still on and said what she had learned from 3 different sources over the past week. Gerald had been in Harrington's store talking about the Whitfield property as if its change of ownership was already settled. He had brought a man out from Denver 2 weeks before serving the notice, a man connected to a mining operation from Ohio. He had known about the coal under the eastern field before Harold died. He had not pressed the informal loan for years, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment was the death of Harold Whitfield and the resulting isolation of a widow without family or resources. Ellie listened to all of it without interrupting. He's already sold it, she said when May finished, before he owns it. That's what it looks like, May said. She looked at Colt. You figured out the coal. When he offered the mineral rights instead of cash payment, Colt said, it was the wrong move for a man who only wanted his money back. May nodded. She studied him with the direct assessment she had been applying since she arrived. You're going to help her fight this. Yes, he said. How? Denver, Whitaker, the letter from Gerald that proves he knew there was no enforceable agreement, and the timeline that proves he manufactured the debt crisis deliberately. He paused. We leave on the morning train in 3 days. May looked at Ellie. Something passed between the two women that Colt did not try to read. All right, May said. She stood and buttoned her coat. I'll make some visits while you're gone. There are people in this county who've had dealings with Gerald that deserve a wider audience. At the door, she stopped and looked back at Colt. Take care of her. That's not exactly the right framing, Colt said. May raised her eyebrows. She doesn't need taking care of, he said. She needs someone standing next to her while she takes care of things herself. Those are different bums. May looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Ellie. Keep him, she said, and went out into the cold. The 3 days before Denver passed in the specific rhythm of a household operating under deadline pressure, purposeful and quiet and aware of the stakes without discussing them constantly. Colt finished. The roof confirmed that Ranger's leg had healed clean, and spent one morning in the field pulling rock samples from 3 locations in the eastern quarter that Whitaker could use to support the coal assessment. Ellie organized Harold's papers, wrote a detailed account of every interaction with Gerald, dating back to Harold's death, and assembled the ledger records that showed the homestead's finances clearly enough that no one could argue she had been mismanaging it. They did not discuss what would happen after Denver. Neither of them was ready to, and both of them knew it, and the knowing sat between them companionably rather than with tension. On the evening before they were to leave, Colt was at the table, cleaning the tack, when Ellie came in from the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. He looked up. I've been thinking about something, she said. Tell me. When Harold died, people came with food and condolences, and the particular kindness of people who don't know what to say and say things anyway. I thanked them all, and I meant the thanks. She came to the table and sat down across from him. But underneath the gratitude was something I'm ashamed to name. He waited. Relief, she said. Not at his death. Harold was decent to me in his way, but relief that the next morning I could arrange the kitchen the way that made sense to me and keep the accounts I wanted to keep and not explain my reasoning to anyone. She looked at her hands. I had been invisible for 3 years, useful and invisible, and I found that I preferred the silence of being alone to the silence of being unseen. He set down the strap he was working on. And then you knocked on my door. she said. And you opened it, he said. I did. She looked at him. I want you to know why I'm letting you come to Denver with me. Why I said we instead of I when we talked to May. It's not because I need you to manage this. I could go to Denver alone and find Whitaker and make the case and it might work. I know that, he said. I'm letting you come because for the first time in longer than I can account for someone is paying attention to what I actually need rather than what they've decided I need. And that is a more valuable thing than I knew how to miss until you showed up and I started missing it retroactively. He looked at her across the lamp. Ellie, he said, I'm going to say something and you don't have to respond to it tonight. She nodded. I stopped moving because of Ranger's leg and your roof. Those were the practical reasons. But I've stayed because of you specifically, not because of the roof or the situation or any abstract sense of being useful. He paused. I don't know what that means yet in terms of what comes next, but I wanted you to know it's true. She held his gaze for a long time. I know, she said finally. I've known for a few days. I've been deciding what to do with knowing it. Have you decided? Not entirely, she said, but I'm going to Denver with you tomorrow, which is a decision in a direction. He picked up the strap again. She got up and went to the stove to put on the water for the night. They left on the morning train. The train from Silver Ridge to Denver took 4 hours, and they sat in the third-class car because it was what Ellie could afford, and Colt did not suggest otherwise. The car was warm from the press of bodies and smelled of wool and coal smoke and the particular humanity of people in transit. And outside the window, the high plains gave way to the foothills, and the foothills to the first real sight of the mountains, vast and indifferent and permanent, in a way that made everything below them feel appropriately scaled. Ellie sat by the window and watched the landscape move. Colt read a folded paper he had brought, and then put it away and watched the mountains and thought about the conversation the previous evening and about the specific quality of honesty Ellie brought to everything, the refusal to dress things up as something other than what they were, which was a quality he had valued in people his whole life and found increasingly rare. After a while, she said without preamble, I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth, even if it's complicated. Go ahead. Do you think this works? She did not look at him. Not the case, not Whitaker, I mean this. A small gesture that indicated the space between them. Two people who arrived at each other through a storm and a broken leg and a bad debt. Do you think it works? He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. I think it works, he said. I think it requires honesty and patience and the willingness to say hard things clearly, which you are better at than most people I've met. I think it requires someone not running. He paused. I stopped running when I stopped knowing why I was still going. That was before I knocked on your door. You didn't make me stop. You gave me a reason to stay stopped. She looked at him for a moment. That's a more complicated answer than yes, she said. You asked for the truth even if it was complicated. She turned back to the window. After a while, she put her hand on his where it rested on the armrest between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they rode the rest of the way to Denver like that without discussing it because some things did not require discussion to be settled. Whitaker's office was on the second floor of a building on Larimer Street that smelled of old wood and pipe tobacco and the specific dusty authority of accumulated legal work. Whitaker himself was 60-something, spare and precise with the careful eyes of a man who had learned that most legal problems were really human problems wearing official clothing. He listened to Ellie's account without interrupting. He read the notice, he read the letter with the phrase arrangement we discussed. He looked at the timeline Ellie had prepared and the rock samples Colt had pulled from the eastern field and the ledger pages showing the homestead's finances. Then he set everything down and looked at both of them. The loan has no written documentation, he said. An oral agreement for a sum this size is not enforceable under Colorado statute. Gerald knows this. The debt claim is not his primary strategy. It is leverage. He leaned back in his chair. The counter strategy is to challenge the debt in court and simultaneously document the mineral potential of the eastern field to establish that the rights Gerald is trying to acquire have substantial value. We can also pursue a fraud claim based on the deliberate absence of documentation and the evidence that Gerald had a buyer arranged before serving the notice. How much time do you need? Ellie asked. 8 weeks minimum. Whitaker looked at them steadily. You have, by my count, 23 days remaining. The room was quiet. Colt looked at Ellie. She was looking at the window at the Denver street below, doing what he had come to recognize as her way of processing difficulty, going very still on the outside, while her mind moved quickly through the problem. Whitaker said carefully, "There is another avenue. Under Colorado law, the property rights of a married woman and her husband are legally unified. A challenge to sole ownership becomes significantly more complicated when there are two parties involved rather than one. Gerald would need to make his case against both simultaneously, which increases his exposure and his costs and his timeline considerably. It would buy us the 8 weeks we need." A silence settled over the room. Colt said, "Give us a few minutes." They stood in the hallway outside Whitaker's office, and the sounds of Larimer Street rose from below, wagon wheels and voices, and the city going about its business without any awareness of what was being decided in the hallway above it. "No," Ellie said before he could speak. "Hear me out. I know what you're going to say. You're going to frame it as a practical solution that makes sense legally and costs neither of us anything irreversible. All of that is true. And I'm saying no," she said. "Not because the logic is wrong, because I did this once already. I answered an advertisement and got on a train and married a man I had never met because it solved a problem. I spent 3 years being useful and invisible, and I am not doing that again, not even with a man I actually respect." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to do that again," he said. "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you something different." He spoke quietly, the way he spoke when what he was saying mattered more than how he was saying it. "I stopped moving 8 years ago in my own head on the night Emily died, and my body just didn't get the message for a while. It kept going. Fort Worth to Denver, to places without names. Going because stopping meant feeling what had happened." He paused. "I knocked on your door in a storm because Ranger needed shelter. That's the honest beginning. But somewhere in the past 2 weeks, the reason for staying changed. It's you, not the roof or the debt or the situation. You." She was very still. "I am not proposing a transaction," he said. "I am telling you that I have not wanted to be anywhere specific in 8 years, and I want to be here, with you specifically, in whatever capacity you're willing to have me." She looked at him for a long time. "This is the fastest decision I've ever been asked to make," she said. "I know. I'm sorry for that." "Don't be." She looked at the closed door of Whitaker's office and then back at him. "I decided something the morning after you arrived. When I came out to the barn and you told me the animals were checked and the coffee was already on your list. I decided that whatever this was, I wasn't going to run from it." She took a breath. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He reached out his right hand, the scarred one, and she put her left hand in it, and they stood like that for a moment in the hallway of a lawyer's office in Denver, Colorado, before going back inside to tell Whitaker to proceed on all fronts and to ask him where they could find a judge authorized to perform a civil marriage before the end of the day. They were married at 4 in the afternoon in the office of a judge on Blake Street with Whitaker and his secretary as witnesses. Ellie wore the navy wool dress she had brought from Boston and preserved carefully for 4 years because she had never had occasion to feel like it was worth using. Colt wore the clean shirt May Cooper had pressed before they left. The judge asked the required questions. When he asked Ellie if she entered this marriage of her own free will, she looked at Colt and said, "More freely than anything I've ever done." That was not the required language. The judge accepted it anyway. On the train back to Silver Ridge, with the mountains going dark in the west and the first stars appearing over the plains, Ellie sat beside Colt rather than across from him, and after a while she put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they rode through the Colorado dark without needing to fill it with words. After a long while, she said, "I should tell you something." "Tell me." "I was afraid. All of it from the day the notice came. I've been afraid for months. I got good at not showing it because there was no one to show it to." "I know," he said. "You could tell the first morning, the way you held yourself when you stood up from the snow, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a longer time and had learned to carry it efficiently." He paused. "It changed gradually over the past 2 weeks." "When did it change?" He thought about it. "When you refused the money from the ranch," he said, "because you understood what it was. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are. She was quiet for a moment, then, I want to say something about that. Wait, I didn't refuse it to be noble. I refused it because taking it would have made this into the same thing my marriage to Harold was. A transaction. I did not want that. She was quiet. I wanted something real or nothing at all. You're getting something real, he said. I know, she said. That's what I'm telling you. They arrived at Silver Ridge at 11 at night, and May Cooper was waiting at the station because May Cooper had calculated the train schedule and decided that waiting was better than wondering. She looked at them both in the lamplight on the platform, at the way they were standing, and something in her face settled. The cow got out this afternoon, she said. I put her back. Everything else is fine. Thank you, May, Ellie said. May looked at Colt. Take care of her, she said, which was what she had said before. I said before that's not the right framing, Colt said. I heard you, May said. I'm saying it anyway, because taking care of someone and respecting what they can do for themselves aren't opposites. A man who understands that distinction knows how to do both. She looked between them. Looks like you understand it. She walked to her wagon and drove off into the dark without waiting for a response. They drove back to the homestead through the cold night, and the stars over Colorado were the kind that only existed where there was no competing light, and Ellie looked up at them through the wagon boards and thought about Boston and the employment agency, and the clerk who had looked at her over his spectacles, and she thought about the train to Colorado, and Harold's formal handshake at the station, and the 3 years of being useful and invisible, and she thought about a blizzard and a knock at the door, and the specific decision to open it. The homestead came into view at the end of the road. You need to know something, Colt said. They had not spoken for the last mile. Tell me. I'm not going anywhere. I want to say it plainly without qualification. Whatever Gerald does, whatever the court decides, whatever happens with that field, I'm here. She looked at the homestead. At the roof that was sound now, at the fence line that would hold at the barn where Ranger was sleeping in a clean stall. 40 years is a long time to run, she said. Yes, he said, it is. What made you stop truly? He thought about it for a moment. I stopped moving because of Ranger's leg, he said. That's the honest beginning. But I stayed stopped because you left a light on. He looked at her. When I came back from Silver Ridge for the roofing materials, you left the kitchen lamp on. You didn't have to. It would have been easy enough for me to find my way in the dark. But it was on. She was quiet. It was on because it seemed like the right thing to do, she said. It was, he said. It told me something. What did it tell you? He looked at the homestead, at the dark shape of it against the night sky. That someone was expecting me back, he said. They went inside together to the warmth of the stove in the kitchen, and the small carved horse on the shelf above the window where she had placed it, and the night settled around them with the particular quality of a night in which something difficult has been resolved in the right direction. In the morning, they began the next part. The days that followed had a rhythm neither of them had arranged consciously, but which felt from inside it exactly right. Colt took work from neighboring homesteads, repairs, and construction that his reputation spread through May's conversations faster than he would have managed on his own. Ellie organized the school that had been forming in her mind since the first time she had helped the Harkins girl with her reading at May's kitchen table. 5 days passed, then 7. The deadline counted down and Whitaker's letters arrived from Denver with the methodical regularity of a man who had taken a case seriously. On the morning of the 18th day, Frank Holt came to the homestead alone. Colt saw him coming from the south field where he was resetting the fence posts that had heaved with the freeze and thaw. He watched Holt dismount at the front of the cabin and knock, and Ellie appear in the doorframe. He set down his tools and walked around the cabin without hurrying. He arrived at the corner of the house as Holt moved slightly inside the doorframe, angling his body in a way that had nothing to do with official business and everything to do with the specific confidence of a man who thought he was alone with a woman who had no recourse. Ellie's posture changed, a small shift that only someone paying attention would catch. Colt walked to the porch steps and stopped there. Holt turned his head. Colt said nothing. He simply stood, and what was in his expression was not threat and not anger, but the complete and settled certainty of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the situation to catch up with it. Holt stepped back from the doorframe. Maddox, he said. Deputy, Colt said. He looked at Ellie. Everything all right? Mr. Holt was just leaving, she said. Holt's jaw tightened. Gerald's not going to like this. Gerald's going to like it considerably less in 2 weeks when Whitaker's filing reaches the circuit court, Colt said. That's where things stand. Good morning, Deputy. Holt stood for a moment longer, then got back on his horse and rode out. That evening, Ellie told Colt what Holt had said before he arrived, and Colt listened to all of it and then said, "Well, he won't come back alone." He said it simply as a fact about how men like Holt operated. But he won't need to. We'll be in front of the council before he has the chance. She looked at him. You're very calm about all of this. Getting agitated doesn't help the problem read differently, he said. Save the emotion for when it's useful. When is it useful? He held her gaze. Right now it would be useful for you to know that I'm angry on your behalf. That what he did just now and what Gerald has been doing since Harold died deserves more than a courtroom. He paused. But the courtroom is what we have, so we use it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not a gesture of consolation, a gesture of alliance. Together, she said. Together, he agreed. The council hearing was held in the Silver Ridge Town Hall 14 days after their return from Denver. Whitaker had moved faster than he had promised he could, which Colt had suspected once the fraud angle became clear, because lawyers who had been in practice long enough developed an instinct for the cases that mattered. The room was fuller than Gerald had expected. May Cooper's visits had been thorough. 4 families sat in the rows behind Ellie and Colt families whose own dealings with Gerald Whitfield bore a structural resemblance to Harold's situation. They had not been asked to testify. They were simply there as faces, as the visible shape of a pattern. Gerald arrived with his lawyer in the composure of a man who had attended many hearings and won most of them. He looked at the room and then at Colt, and for a moment something moved across his face that was not concern exactly, but was its near neighbor. Whitaker presented the case the way he did everything methodically and without theater. The absence of written documentation, the letter-using arrangement we discussed. The timeline showing Gerald had arranged a buyer before serving the notice. The structural conclusion, the debt was manufactured, leverage for the acquisition of mineral rights, worth many times its stated value. Gerald's lawyer argued well. He was prepared, and he made the best case the facts allowed, which was that an oral agreement remained an agreement and that Gerald's interest in the mineral rights was coincidental. Then May Cooper stood up. She had not been scheduled to speak. She simply stood in the front row with the authority of a woman who had been in this county 20 years and knew exactly what she had the right to say. I have something to say that is not legal argument, she said. I was at Eleanor Whitfield's wedding. I signed the certificate. I have been her neighbor since she arrived in this county, and I have watched her keep that homestead running alone through a Colorado winter on resources that would have defeated most men I know. She looked at each council member in turn. What Gerald Whitfield has done is not a debt collection. It is a calculation. He saw a young woman alone and without family, and he decided she was an opportunity. She sat down. I am asking this council to see it for what it is. The room was very quiet. The council deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, the chairman read the findings plainly. The debt, absent written documentation and in context of the evidence presented, was not enforceable under Colorado statute. The action for property seizure was dismissed. A formal investigation into Gerald Whitfield's financial dealings would be recommended to the circuit court. Deputy Frank Holt was suspended pending that investigation. Gerald sat very still while the chairman spoke. Then he stood and his lawyer gathered the papers and Gerald walked toward the door. He had to pass Colt, who was standing near the back of the room, and he stopped. You're a drifting hand, Gerald said. No property, no standing, no name in this county before this month. All true, Colt said, and you still lost. Gerald walked out. Colt did not watch him go. He was already looking at Ellie, who was standing near the front of the room with May, and her face was open in a way he had not seen it before the careful management gone the practiced composure simply unnecessary for the first time. She looked like someone who had set down something heavy and was still getting used to the lightness. He made his way through the room, and when he reached her, May had moved away to speak with Whitaker, and they were briefly alone in the noise. She looked up at him. It's over, she said. This part of it, he said. She smiled, the full one that used her whole face, and said, we changed the ground he was standing on. All of us did, he said. She took his hand right there in the Silver Ridge Town Hall in front of everyone who would certainly have opinions about it, and held it with the certainty of a person who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. They walked out into the winter afternoon together into the cold, clean air of a day after something has been settled and the sky above the plains was the specific shade of blue that only existed at this altitude in this season, deep and certain with nothing provisional about it. Spring came to the Maddox homestead the way it came to the high plains, reluctantly at first and then all at once. One week the ground was still frozen, and the next it was giving underfoot, and the week after that the first green was showing along the creek line, and the willows knew before anything else that the season had turned. Colt expanded the barn that spring, adding a full second stall and a proper tack room and a section of covered storage that Ellie had mentioned needing twice in ordinary conversation, which he had built without making it a discussion, because sometimes the right response to a need was simply to address it. Ellie started the school in April. It began with the Harkins children, four of them, the oldest 12 and the youngest 6, who arrived on the first Monday with their faces scrubbed and their shoes clean. By the end of the month, there were 9 children coming 3 mornings a week from 4 different families, and by summer there were 14. She taught with what she had, which was less than she wanted and more than she made excuses about, and she found in the process something she had not known was missing from her life, which was the specific satisfaction of watching a mind open. The cautious ones and the bold ones, and the ones who pretended not to care and cared most of all, she found the thread for each of them, the particular angle of approach that made the material accessible, and she pulled on that thread until the door came open. Colt watched this from various distances, from the barn or the field or the porch, and he thought about the woman who had answered a door in a blizzard with a rifle and no expectation of anything but more difficulty. And he thought about the woman who now stood in her yard explaining long division to a 12-year-old boy who was going to understand it before he left today, because she would find the way to make him understand. And he could not entirely account for the feeling this produced, and except to recognize that it was something he had not felt in 8 years and had not expected to feel again. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. In the summer, on a morning when the light came through the kitchen window, at the angle that made everything look briefly more beautiful than it was, Ellie put her coffee down on the table and said his name, the way she said it when she had decided to say something. He looked up from the harness he was mending at the other end of the table. She told him. He set the harness down. He looked at his hands on the table, the scarred right one and the left one. Then he looked at her with an expression he could not control and did not try to. He had stood in the frozen ground in Texas in the winter of 1879 and buried people he loved, and told himself in the years after that it was better not to want this again. That the arithmetic of love was weighted toward loss, and a man who had already paid that price might be forgiven for declining to pay again. He had been wrong about that. He knew it now with a clarity that made the previous 8 years feel for just a moment like a long detour toward a place he had always been going. He got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and went to one knee beside her chair, which put him almost at eye level with her, close enough for her to see everything in his face without his having managed any of it. "Ellie," he said. Her name was all he had for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know what you're feeling." "Yes, I'm frightened too." "Yes." She put her hand on his face. He leaned into it the way Ranger leaned into his hand, without thinking, because some responses live below the level of decision. "We'll be frightened together," she said. "That's the arrangement." "That's always been the arrangement," he said. She smiled. He smiled back, the rare full one that still caught her slightly off guard after all these months, as if she had not entirely finished adjusting to the fact of it. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she said. "In the spring. Dr. Morrison thinks April." He looked at her and thought, this is what the money was waiting for. Not to pay a debt or fix a problem. Just this. The reason it existed. They told May that afternoon. May put down the bread she was kneading and looked at both of them, and then looked up at the kitchen ceiling for a long moment in the manner of someone offering a private word of thanks to whatever authority she held responsible for good outcomes. "Finally," she said, and went back to the bread. That evening, Colt stood at the fence line of the eastern field in the long summer light. Ellie came out and stood beside him. "I've been thinking about this field," he said. "What about it?" "Plant something in it, something that takes a long time to establish. something that'll still be here in 20 years. He looked at the soil, the same soil he had read on a winter afternoon that now felt like a different life. Apple trees. She looked at the field. Apple trees in Colorado. High country varieties. They manage, he paused. Our children will eat those apples. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he heard everything the word contained. Children, plural, the future not as a continuation of the past, but as its own thing, open and possible. Plant them in the spring, she said, when the ground thaws. Yes, he said, in the spring. The baby came on a morning in April when the apple saplings they had put in 3 weeks earlier were showing their first tentative leaves small and determined the specific green of things that have just committed to being alive. The labor was long, and the midwife from Silver Ridge arrived in the late morning with the competent seriousness of a woman who had done this many times. And May was there and Colt was there in the room in a manner that the midwife noted was unusual, and then stopped noting because Ellie had taken his hand in the second hour and had not let it go, and there was no practical way to address the situation without making it worse. He talked to her through the hours the way he talked to frightened horses, not the words themselves, but the quality of them, low and even, and containing the absolute conviction that this was survivable and that he was not going anywhere and that she was not alone in this room. There were 2 hours near the end that were not straightforward. He knew it from the midwife's face and from May's, and he kept his own face the opposite of what he felt, which was a terror he had not experienced since Texas, the terror of being in a room where someone he loved was in danger and there was nothing to do except stay. He had not been in this position with Emily. He had found her already too far gone. He had never had the chance to stay. He bent close to Ellie's ear in the worst of it. Eleanor Maddox, he said, her full name, the name she had chosen. Listen to me. You opened a door in a blizzard when every sensible instinct said not to. You stood in a council hall and told the truth to men who had been paid to decide against you. You have been making the harder choice for as long as I have known you, and considerably longer than that. He paused. This is one more, and I have never once watched you make the harder choice and fail to come through it. She made a sound that was not a word. One more, he said, right here with me. One more. The sound that followed was the smallest sound he had ever heard and the loudest. A girl. The midwife set her in Ellie's arms, and Ellie looked down at her with an expression Colt had no prior category for, total and unguarded and enormous. And the baby's face was red, and her hair was dark, and her hands were the size of the carved horse he had made in the barn in the first week of knowing Ellie. He reached out his right hand, the scarred one, and the baby's fingers closed around his thumb with a grip that was surprisingly definite for something so small. Her name, the midwife said. Ellie looked at Colt. He looked at the baby, at this new face, at the evidence that something was possible that he had spent 8 years deciding was not. Hope, he said. The word came out steady. Her name is Hope. May stood in the corner of the room with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes bright, and she did not cry, but it was a near thing. The months that followed were the kind of months that do not make good stories because they are too full of what makes a good life. The school grew. The barn was sound. Ranger retired to a life of light work and abundant hay, and the daily conversations Colt continued to have with him as a matter of habit and genuine respect. The apple saplings in the eastern fields survived their first summer and began slowly and with the commitment of things that intend to last to put down roots. Hope grew the way babies grow when they are loved well, with a speed that seemed impossible and an unhurriedness that felt like it could not end soon enough, and both things were true simultaneously, which Colt had been told was the defining characteristic of this particular experience, and which he found to be exactly accurate. On an evening in October when the light over the Rockies was the bronze color that only came in that season, Colt sat on the porch with Hope in his arms and watched the sun go down. She was awake, her attention fixing on things with the fierce concentration of someone encountering the world for the first time and finding it consistently extraordinary. A moth near the lamp. Colt's hand when he moved it slowly across her field of vision. The mountains in the distance, which she regarded with what appeared to be the beginning of an appropriate sense of scale. Ellie came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee. The good kind, the kind that had been a permanent feature of the kitchen shelf since the morning after their return from Denver. You've gone quiet, she said, the kind of quiet that means something. Colt looked at the mountains. My father, he said. He never left Pennsylvania. Born there, worked there, buried there. One place his whole life. He paused. When I was young, I thought that sounded like not enough territory, not enough experience. And now I think he knew something I had to ride 2,000 miles to learn. He looked at hope in his arms, at the dark hair and the wide gray eyes. A man can spend his whole life building things for people who don't notice, or moving through places that don't hold him. Or he can stop somewhere and build one thing that matters with people who see him clearly, and that thing will still be standing long after he is not. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Did you find it, she said, the thing worth building? He looked at her. I found it the morning after the storm, he said. When you opened that door, I just needed the rest of the time to understand what I was looking at. She leaned against him, fitting into the space at his side that she had been fitting into for almost a year now easily, and without adjustment the way things fit when they have found their right arrangement. Hope reached up with one small hand and closed her fingers around Colt's thumb. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with the absolute attention of someone who had not yet learned to pretend that some things mattered less than they did. She does that every time, Ellie said. Every time, he agreed. The sun finished its work over the Rockies, and the sky went from bronze to violet to the deep blue that came before the stars. The stars themselves appeared one at a time, the way they always did over the high plains, slowly at first and then everywhere at once. They were the same stars that had been overhead on the night of the blizzard, on the night Colt had ridden toward a light he could barely see through the snow, on the night a woman had stood at her door with a rifle too big for her and decided to open it anyway. Those stars had watched all of it. They watched now without comment, which was their nature, cold and old, and beyond the scale of anything happening below them. But the important things were not up there. Ellie reached up and put her open palm against his face, and he turned into it without thinking about it. And in the eastern field, the apple trees stood in the last of the light, their first season branches thin and committed, their roots going down into the same ground that had held Cole in a scheme, and the long patience of a bad man going down through all of that into something older and more permanent that had been waiting beneath it all along. Inside the cabin, on the shelf above the kitchen window, a small carved horse stood where Ellie had placed it on a winter evening when she had decided that some things were worth keeping. The light from inside threw its warmth outward into the gathering dark, the way light does without asking whether the dark deserves it, simply because that is what light does when you let it. Tell me something, Ellie said. What, something you know to be true? Right now. He thought about the man in Decker's bar in Pueblo who had not touched his whiskey and had not known where he was going when he stepped out into the storm. He thought about what that man had believed, which was that there was nothing left to build and nowhere that would hold him and no one who would see him as something other than what loss had made of him. That man was wrong, he said. She tilted her head to look at him. What man? The one who rode out of Pueblo in a blizzard 8 years after losing everything, thinking the moving was keeping him alive when really it was just keeping him from having to feel what had happened. He looked at her. He was wrong about there being nothing left, about the building being finished. He just needed to stop long enough to find out. Ellie was quiet for a moment. He stopped, she said. He stopped, Colt said. Someone left a light on. Hope made a small sound in his arms and settled deeper into his chest, her breath evening, out towards sleep, trusting absolutely and without hesitation in the arms that held her. Outside, Colorado spread in every direction under the wide and patient sky, holding everything on its surface with the same permanent fidelity it had always offered, the frozen ground in winter, and the apple trees in spring, and the people who had learned at some cost and through some grace that a place becomes a home the moment you stop running from what it asks of you. And sometimes what it asks is simply this: stay. Build something true. Let yourself be seen. They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out and the cold had made its presence known, and hope had fallen into the deep sleep of someone with nothing to be afraid of. And then they went inside together to the warmth and the light and the life that had been built, one decision at a time, beginning with a door opened in a storm by a woman who had every reason not to open it and opened it anyway. That was the beginning of everything.